The invitation arrived on a Thursday, and Cecelia Vane had exactly 9 days to decide whether she was brave enough to walk back into the house where she was born. She stood at the window of her rented room in the village of Ashwick, holding the card between 2 fingers as though it might bite. The paper was good quality. She knew that without looking closely, knew it the way she knew the sound of the clock in the front hall, the particular creak of the 3rd step on the east staircase, the smell of beeswax and old wood that no amount of money could manufacture if it hadn't been earned through a century of living. She had grown up with that smell. She had not smelled it in 4 years. The card read, "Dunmore Hall requests the presence of suitable candidates for the position of lady's companion to the Dowager Countess. Inquiries to be directed to Mrs. Parton, housekeeper, no later than the 14th. Cecelia set it down on the windowsill. Outside, the elm trees were doing what elm trees did in late October, dropping their leaves in a slow, indifferent way, as though the whole business of autumn was something they'd agreed to only reluctantly. The lane below was empty. The village was the kind of place where nothing much happened before 10 in the morning, and it was not yet 8. She had found the card pinned to the notice board outside the post office 3 days ago. She had walked past it twice before she stopped. The handwriting on the notice was Mrs. Parton's. She'd have known it anywhere, the careful loops, the way the capital D dropped slightly below the line. Mrs. Parton had been housekeeper at Dunmore Hall for 22 years. She had also once taught Cecelia to make shortbread on a rainy afternoon in January, when Cecelia was 7 years old and her mother was still alive, and the world was a simpler and more forgiving place. Mrs. Parton would not recognize her. Cecelia was reasonably certain of this. 4 years was a long time, and she had been 19 when she left, thin and frightened, and wearing a coat that was slightly too large for her. She was not thin now, not in the same way, and she was not frightened, not in the same way either. She had cut her hair. She had learned, through necessity, to hold her face in a particular kind of stillness that people tended to read as either competence or coldness, depending on what they needed from her at the time. She picked up the card again. Dunmore Hall, her father's house, her house by rights, though rights had proven to be a more complicated matter than anyone had told her they would be. She had 9 days. She wrote the letter of application that same evening, using the name she had been using for 2 years, Miss C. Hartwood. The C stood for Cecelia, which was perhaps reckless, but she had found that small anchors to the truth made lying considerably easier to sustain. The Hartwood was her mother's maiden name. Her mother had been a Hartwood of Somerset, the kind of family that had been quietly respectable for generations without ever quite accumulating the money to match their manners. Nobody at Dunmore Hall would know the name. She described her experience honestly. She had, in fact, spent the last 18 months as a paid companion to an elderly widow in Derbyshire, a Mrs. Fenwick who was sharp-tongued and often difficult, and who had taught Cecelia, among other things, how to play chess and how to disagree with someone without making it obvious you were disagreeing. Mrs. Fenwick had died in August. She had left Cecelia a small sum and a letter of reference that described her as possessed of unusual patience and good sense, which Cecelia had read 3 times, because it was the kindest thing anyone had said about her in some time. She sent the letter. She did not sleep well for the next 5 nights. The reply came on the 7th day, written in Mrs. Parton's careful hand. Miss Hartwood was invited to present herself at Dunmore Hall on the following Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for an interview with the Countess and the Earl. The Earl. Cecelia read the word twice and then set the letter down with more care than was strictly necessary. She had not considered the Earl. She had been thinking of the hall as it had been when she left it. Her stepmother's territory, her stepmother's domain, the particular cold efficiency with which Rowena Vane had arranged every room and every person in it to suit herself. She had not accounted for the fact that in 4 years things changed. People changed. New people arrived. She asked the woman at the post office, carefully, in the way of someone with only a passing interest in local affairs, whether Dunmore Hall had new ownership. Not new exactly, the woman said, wrapping a parcel without looking up. The old Earl died 2 winters back. Pneumonia. The new Earl's his nephew. Came down from Edinburgh, people say. Nobody much knows him yet. He's been here 8 months, and he hasn't done anything scandalous, which around here people seem to find almost as interesting as if he had. And the Countess? Cecelia asked. The Dowager. Oh, she's still there. Very much still there. 91 years old, they say, though some put her younger. Sharp as a pin, apparently. The new Earl keeps her in the East Wing. The woman looked up. You thinking of going up there? I have an interview on Monday, Cecelia said. The woman nodded with the particular expression of someone who had opinions, but was restraining them out of politeness. Well, she said, good luck to you. She walked up the long drive on Monday afternoon with her good coat buttoned to the throat and her hair pinned in the way that made her look, she hoped, like someone who had never in her life known anything about this particular house. The beeches on either side of the drive had been planted by her grandfather. She did not look at them. The door was answered by a young footman she did not know, which was a relief. She gave her name, Miss Hartwood, and was shown into the small sitting room off the front hall. It had been repainted. The walls had been green when she left. They were now a deep, quiet blue. Someone with taste had made that decision. She was not sure whether to find it comforting or disorienting. She was waiting for perhaps 12 minutes when the door opened and Mrs. Parton came in. Cecilia's breath caught once, quietly, and then settled. Mrs. Parton was older. Of course she was older. The gray in her hair was more pronounced, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had begun to make their opinions known. But her face was the same level gaze, the same slight compression of the lips that indicated she was forming a judgment and had not yet decided to share it. She looked at Cecelia. Cecelia looked back. Miss Hartwood, Mrs. Parton said. Mrs. Parton, Cecelia said, because the name was on the card and she had no reason to pretend she hadn't read it. Something shifted, very briefly, in Mrs. Parton's expression. Cecelia could not tell what it was. It was gone too quickly. The Countess will see you shortly, Mrs. Parton said. The Earl has been delayed. He may join us later. She sat down across from Cecelia in a way that suggested this was her usual chair, and that she had sat in it, in this room, through a great many interviews, with a great many people, and had formed correspondingly calibrated expectations. Your reference is from a Mrs. Fenwick of Derbyshire, she said. Yes, she speaks well of you. She was generous. Mrs. Parton considered this. She describes you as patient and sensible. She does not describe you as warm. Cecelia allowed a small pause. The Countess is 91, she said. I imagine she has more use for patient and sensible than she does for warm. Something moved at the corner of Mrs. Parton's mouth. She would agree with you, she said. She says warmth is for puppies. The Countess was not what Cecelia had expected, though she wasn't certain what she had expected. A woman who had survived 91 years in a house like this one had presumably survived it by being something specific, something durable. She was small. Cecelia noticed that first. Small in the way of old people who had once been taller, who had spent decades in a body that no longer quite matched the space they occupied in the world. She sat in a chair by the window of the east sitting room, with a rug across her lap and a pair of reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead in the manner of someone who had put them there 20 minutes ago, and forgotten about them entirely. She looked at Cecelia with gray eyes that were not in any way the eyes of someone who had forgotten anything. Sit down, she said. Cecelia sat. "You're young," the Countess said. "I'm 23. That's young. I was 23 once. I thought I knew everything. I didn't know anything." She paused. "Do you know anything?" "I know a moderate amount," Cecelia said. "Enough to know I don't know everything." The Countess appeared to find this acceptable. "Mrs. Fenwick taught you chess." "She did." "Do you play well?" "Well enough that she kept asking me to play, which I believe means I was either genuinely useful or sufficiently bad that she could always win." "Which was it?" Cecelia thought about it honestly. Both, at different times. The Countess made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You'll do," she said. "Unless my nephew finds an objection, which I expect he won't, because he doesn't object to things unless they inconvenience him personally." As though the word had summoned him. And perhaps it had, Cecelia thought later. Perhaps the house still worked that way, still arranged itself around the people who lived in it. The door opened. She did not turn around immediately. She heard his footsteps. She heard him say something brief to Mrs. Parton in the hall. She heard the door close behind him as he came into the room. Then she turned and looked at the Earl of Dunmore. He was not what she had expected either. She wasn't sure why she had expected anything particular. The old Earl had been 60 and gruff, and had smelled of pipe tobacco. But this man was neither old nor gruff, and if he smelled of anything, she was not close enough yet to determine what. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more. He was watching her with an expression she had learned, over the past 2 years, to read reasonably accurately. He was someone who noticed things, and who had not yet decided what to do with what he'd noticed. "Miss Hartwood," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He sat down. The interview that followed was courteous and thorough and entirely unremarkable, and Cecelia answered every question honestly, which was the most efficient form of deception she had found. The honest answers were all true. They simply omitted the single fact that would have changed everything. By the end of it, she had the position. She moved in on a Wednesday, which she had always considered the most honest day of the week. The room she was given was in the east wing, 2 doors down from the Countess, overlooking the kitchen garden. It was a smaller room than she had been given as a child, but it was warmer. Someone had put in a new fireplace, and the window faced south. So the afternoon light came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more manageable than it was. She unpacked her 2 cases. She arranged her few books on the small shelf above the writing table. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. She was inside the house. That was the first thing. She was inside the house, and she had not been recognized, and the position was legitimate and paid, and she had 4 months. That was what the Countess had offered, a trial period of 4 months, to find out what she needed to find out. What she needed to find out was this: what had happened to the deed. Her father had told her 3 weeks before he died. 3 weeks before, Rowena Vane had moved with remarkable efficiency from stepmother to administrator of the estate, that there was a second deed to the Dunmore property. Not the deed held by the solicitors, not the official document that Rowena had produced at the reading of the will with an expression of careful grief that had not reached her eyes. A second deed, an older one. One that named Cecilia's mother's family as having claim to the property through a complicated entailment that had never, in anyone's memory, been tested. Her father had not told her where it was. He had been very ill, and then he had been dead, and Rowena had arrived the following morning with the solicitor and the correct documents, and a certainty about the proceedings that Cecelia had been too young and too grief-stricken to challenge effectively. She had left. She had left because she was 19 and alone, and had no proof of anything, and because Rowena had suggested, with enormous politeness, that there was very little for her at Dunmore Hall, and a great deal of world to go and discover. She had spent 4 years discovering it. She had also spent 4 years reading everything she could find about estate entailment, property law, and the particular legal conventions that governed inheritance disputes in England. Mrs. Fenwick, it turned out, had a son who was a barrister and had been delighted to have him explain things to Cecelia over a series of dinners, under the impression that Cecilia's interest was academic. It was not academic. The Countess woke at 7 and expected company by 1:30. She read for an hour, history, mostly, with occasional forays into political philosophy that she then wished to argue about, which suited Cecelia perfectly. They played chess every afternoon at 3. The Countess won approximately 60% of the games, which Cecelia considered the correct proportion. The Earl was present in the house in the way of someone who was trying to be unobtrusive and not entirely succeeding. He appeared at breakfast sometimes and not at others. He rode in the mornings. He had meetings with the estate manager on Thursdays. He read in the library in the evenings, which Cecelia knew because she passed the door occasionally and saw the light under it. He did not, in the first 2 weeks, pay her any particular attention. She did not, in the first 2 weeks, look for the deed. She was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, from grief and from necessity, and from 18 months of chess games with a sharp-tongued widow who had believed that haste was the primary cause of all human suffering. She let herself learn the rhythms of the house first, which doors were used and which were not, which rooms had been changed and which were still the same, where Rowena's things had been and whether any trace of them remained. Rowena had left when the old Earl arrived from Edinburgh 8 months ago. This was what Mrs. Parton told her, in the careful, neutral way of someone who had opinions about this and was not going to share them. Rowena had left and taken a house in Bath and been, apparently, no difficulty since. The word apparently was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Cecelia filed it away. She found the first clue in the library, 3 weeks into her time at Dunmore Hall. She had gone in on a Sunday afternoon when she knew the Earl was out riding. She was not searching, not exactly. She was simply reacquainting herself with the room, the way you might walk through a place you'd loved in childhood and count the things that had changed. The books were largely as she remembered them. The globe in the corner had been moved. The desk was different. She was running her finger along the spines of a row of legal texts when she heard the door. She turned. The Earl stood in the doorway, still in his riding coat, with the expression of someone who had not expected to find anyone in the library and was recalibrating accordingly. "Miss Hartwood," he said. "Your Grace," she said, "I apologize. I thought the room was unoccupied." "I'll leave." "Don't," he said. "I only came in to return a book." He crossed to the shelf near the window, not the shelf she'd been looking at, she noted, and slid a volume back into place. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the spine. Then he turned. "My great-aunt tells me you argue with her," he said. Cecelia felt the pull toward caution and let it pass. "She argues with me," she said. "I simply don't concede the point when I believe she's wrong." He looked at her for a moment with that look she'd noticed before, the noticing look. "She hasn't had anyone disagree with her in some time," he said. "I suspect that's been worse for her than the disagreements." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition, the particular look of someone who has thought something privately and is surprised to hear it said aloud. "She likes you," he said. "She likes beating me at chess," Cecelia said. "I'm useful to her. It's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Isn't it?" She didn't have an answer for that. He didn't seem to require one. He nodded, once, and left the library, and Cecelia stood for a moment with her hand still near the shelf of legal texts, and reminded herself, carefully, what she was here to do. She found the deed on a Tuesday, 6 weeks in, and she almost missed it. She had been working through the archive room, a room off the library that most of the staff seemed to have forgotten existed, under the pretext of organizing old correspondence at the Countess's request. The Countess had described it as a disaster from top to bottom, and I'd deal with it myself if my eyes were any use. This was useful in ways Cecelia had not explicitly engineered, but was grateful for. The room was, in fact, a disaster. Decades of papers, correspondence, household accounts, and legal documents had accumulated in a system that appeared to have begun with good intentions sometime in the 1840s, and then lost confidence in itself around 1880. She worked through it methodically, one box at a time. The deed was not in a box. It was in a folio of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and the folio was inside a larger collection of materials relating to the original construction of the East Wing, and the letters themselves were correspondence between Cecilia's grandmother's solicitor and someone named Alderton regarding the terms of the original entailment. The deed was folded inside the third letter in the sequence, inserted so neatly that it might have been there for decades without anyone noticing, which it had. Cecelia sat very still for a long moment. Then she read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and tried to decide what to do with the fact that she had found it and that it said exactly what her father had told her it would say. She was still sitting there when the door opened. She looked up. The Earl stood in the doorway again. He had a way of arriving in rooms at the wrong moment that she was beginning to find either irritating or meaningful, and had not yet decided which. He looked at her. He looked at the paper in her hands. "What is that?" he said. His voice was careful. She made a decision. It was the kind of decision you make when you have run out of time to make a better one, when all the patience in the world has brought you to the edge of something, and the only direction left is through. "It's a deed," she said. "It entails this property, this house, this land, through the maternal line, through the family of the previous Countess of Dunmore. The woman who owned this house before my father married Rowena Wentworth." She paused. "Before my father married my stepmother." The silence that followed was complete. He looked at her. She watched him understand it, not quickly, but properly, the way understanding actually works, in stages, the later stages more complicated than the earlier ones. "Your father," he said. "William Vane," she said, "the previous Earl." "Then you are Cecelia Vane," she said. "Yes." The room was very quiet. Outside, the kitchen garden was doing what it did at this time of year. Nothing, mostly the brown stalks of things that had finished and the earth waiting to begin again. "You came here under a false name," he said. "I came here under my mother's name," she said. "It isn't false. It just isn't the name you knew to look for." "Why?" He crossed his arms. She had noticed he did this when he was thinking rather than when he was angry, which was a useful distinction. "If you had the document, if you knew what it said—" "I didn't know where it was," she said. "I only knew it existed, and I had no means of finding it from the outside." She looked at him steadily. "I needed to be inside the house." He was quiet for a long moment. "This document," he said, "if it says what you believe it says what I know it says. I've spent 4 years learning enough law to understand exactly what it says. It would mean," he continued, "that the estate was never Rowena Wentworth's to claim on your father's behalf, that it should have come to you through the entailment. That everything He stopped. "Yes," Cecelia said. "That's what it means." He sat down. Not at the desk. There was nowhere to sit at the desk, but on the edge of a box of correspondence, in the way of someone who needed a moment and was not going to pretend otherwise. She found she respected that. "I owe you an apology," he said after a while. She had not expected that. "You weren't here," she said. "You came after. I've been living in your house for 8 months. You didn't know it was mine." "That," he said, "doesn't actually make it better." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The late afternoon light came through the small high window, and landed at an angle on the stacks of old paper between them, and for a moment the room felt very large and very quiet in the particular way of rooms where something has just changed. "What do you want to do?" he said. With this, she had planned for this question. She had planned for it, in fact, across 4 years and 18 months of chess games and 2 suitcases and a rented room in Ashwick. She had the answer ready. "I want the solicitor," she said. "The proper one, not the one Rowena used. I want a full review of the estate documents. I want the entailment examined by someone who has no connection to any of the parties involved. And I want to do it properly," she said, "and legally and without any further deception." He nodded. "And Rowena, I want her to be made aware of the document through proper legal channels," Cecelia said. "Nothing more than that. The law will do the rest." "You don't want." "I want what's mine," she said. "I don't want anything that isn't mine. I never have." She paused. That was rather the point. He was quiet again. Then, slowly, something in his expression changed. The careful neutrality he'd been wearing shifted into something less guarded, something that might, in other circumstances, have been the beginning of something else entirely. "You've been here 6 weeks, he said. "Yes, 6 weeks, and you found it. I'm organized," she said, "and I knew what I was looking for. And in 6 weeks," he said, "you managed to win my great-aunt's respect, which I have been attempting to do for 8 months." Cecelia looked at him. "You've been arguing with her wrong," she said. "She doesn't want to win. She wants someone who will make her work for it." He blinked. Then he laughed. Really laughed, the kind that surprised him. She could see it. And the room felt different after, warmer, the high window letting in the last of the afternoon. "Miss Vane," he said, and then corrected himself. "Lady Cecelia. Miss Hartwood," she said, "until the solicitor says otherwise. Is that—" he stopped. "Is that caution or stubbornness?" "Both," she said, "at different times." He looked at her with the noticing look, the one she'd been cataloging without quite meaning to, and she looked back, and outside the kitchen garden was still and brown and waiting, and inside the archive room the old paper smelled of time, and somewhere in the east wing the Countess was probably already wondering why her afternoon chess partner was late. "I'll contact the solicitor tomorrow," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and stood and paused at the door with his hand on the frame, in the way of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you were right to come." She thought about that for a moment. "I know," she said, "but it's worth more, coming from you." He left. She sat for another minute in the quiet room, holding the deed, and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what 4 years of patience had finally, carefully delivered. Then she smoothed the document, folded it precisely along its original creases, and went to find the Countess. She had a chess game to lose, and she was already late.